Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. We'll get started in about a minute or so to let folks log on. All right, welcome, folks. Thank you so much for joining again. My name is Gabby Velasco. I'm a policy associate in the Research to Action Lab at the Urban Institute and part of Urban's team working on upward mobility. We're going to kick off with just a quick Zoom poll to get a sense of who's in the room, where you are in your journey, and where it might be useful for us to focus our panel discussion later. So would love for you to let us know what has been your biggest challenge so far in using data to inform decisions. Has it been limited access to local data, inconsistent or poor quality data, the lack of disaggregated data for what you're looking for, difficulties building community trust, the fact that there's too much data to analyze for you, struggles linking data to actionable strategies, or at this point in your journey, have you not identified any challenges yet? So we'll give folks about a minute to respond. Appreciate you doing this. Awesome results coming in. Appreciate you guys. All right, so looks like, well, I'm glad you all are on this webinar. The most popular answer was challenges linking data to actionable strategies, followed up by limited access to local data. We'll touch on all of these to some extent, but really excited for y'all to also hear from our speakers later on how they've approached this. All right, so here's a quick overview of how we're going to spend the next hour, 15 minutes together. I'll start with just a brief overview of our upward mobility framework and then share some of what we've learned from our work on how to use data to inform strategic priorities. We'll then hear some examples from the field featuring speakers from Pima County, Arizona, and Charlotte-Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. Finally, my colleague Kimberly Burrows will open it up for some substantial discussion and Q&A at the end. Throughout the presentation, we encourage you to ask questions in the Q&A box by clicking that Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Our team will be monitoring questions and answer either directly in chat in the Q&A box or live later on. And we'll have a dedicated Q&A session at the end, as I said. So I imagine many of you are already familiar with our upward mobility framework. But I'm just going to do a brief walkthrough as I think it's helpful context to keep in mind as we transition to a focused discussion on data. So this is the upward mobility framework. I'll then walk through each component of the framework in more depth. So the framework starts with this three-part definition on mobility from poverty developed by the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty. And what the partnership found is that economic success, having good income, having wealth, that alone is not enough. In order to move out of poverty, and importantly, to stay out of poverty, people also need to feel that they have power and autonomy in their lives, that they can make choices and influence actions that affect their future. And also they need to know that they are valued in their community and can contribute to it. This broader conception of mobility beyond just economics is what we refer to as a three-part definition, and it drives our work. People of color are disproportionately impacted by structural barriers to upward mobility in the US, so our framework emphasizes that a focus on racial equity and local upward mobility work is necessary to ensure that all people and all communities can prosper. For that reason, Racial equity acts as the thread that connects all the framework's components from the predictors of mobility and how they are measured, all the way to the desired outcomes of equitable upward mobility. Local leaders applying the framework must embed racial equity in both their processes and their goals to ensure they meet the needs of all they serve. Moving down, the next component of the framework is the pillars. So people cannot surmount systemic barriers to upward mobility on their own. Communities must ensure that residents can access the supports all people need to achieve economic success, power, and dignity. The upward mobility framework identifies 5 pillars of support that are interconnected and essential to mobility. So on the left, rewarding work pays a living wage. It provides dignified work conditions and offers economic security. Our second pillar is high quality education. So from preschool through post-secondary, this provides a crucial avenue to economic and social mobility. Third, opportunity-rich and inclusive neighborhoods. These play a central role in supporting family stability and well-being, access to social and economic opportunities, and also children's chances to thrive and succeed. The fourth pillar is healthy environment and access to good healthcare. This helps people of all ages surmount life's challenges, helps us excel in school and on the job, ensure well-being, and allows people to fully participate in their communities. And the fifth pillar is responsive and just governance. So governance that engages residents in decision-making and serves the needs of all community members with restraint and fairness. The next component of the framework is the predictors. So for local leaders to improve conditions that lead to upward mobility and racial equity, they need to know what to change and how to change it. The predictors give communities that information. The predictors are 24 factors strongly associated in research with long-term economic success, dignity and belonging, and power and autonomy. Some examples of predictors across the 5 pillars include living wages, access to preschool, housing stability, political participation, and you can kind of consider the pillars to be an organizing mechanism for the predictors and then the metrics. Local leaders can measure the status of each predictor and progress towards improving it using our suite of mobility metrics, which are just our way of measuring the predictor and making it actionable. Each metric offers local leaders one way to start assessing and monitoring a predictor over the medium term. So let's look a bit closer at one of the pillars, rewarding work. You'll see that the predictors and the metrics aim to address a pretty wide range of focuses so that localities are informed about more than just unemployment, but also about livable wages, opportunities for income, debt, and opportunities for building wealth through homeownership. Now let's look at the data the metric shows us. The identified predictor of mobility is jobs paying living wages, which we measure by the pay of an average job as compared to the cost of living. This is important for obvious cost of living reasons, but also because the jobs that offer higher earnings tend to also offer employer benefits that are crucial to mobility, like paid time off, quality healthcare, and pensions or retirement contributions. And also workers in better paying jobs tend to have more stable employment. From here, we can also start thinking about local policy interventions that might inform strategies to move the needle on this metric. All right, so let's now move into how to use data to inform strategic priorities. This presentation is organized as a 4-step hyper-simplified process. And while this is organized linearly for clarity, I just want to note that there are so many elements that influence mobility, so your personal journey will look more like a repeating loop where you continually iterate and revisit each step of this process to further detail your mobility planning efforts. So the first step is developing a community vision statement to guide and underpin our data-driven planning. A community vision statement is a simple aspirational description of what you want your community to be like. It's the why you do this work. You can refine it as you mature through your process, but it can also just start with your current understanding of mobility in your community. Your vision can help guide how you prioritize what topics to delve into first, and then guide the kinds of questions you develop and eventually the kinds of strategies you select. This is an example of a statement from one of our partners in Philadelphia. Their community vision statement emphasizes health, safety, economic prosperity, and good quality of life, with a focus on removing barriers to those outcomes. In Chapter 4 of our Toolkit for Increasing Upward Mobility in Your Community, we include an activity worksheet that you can use to guide your group through the exercise of creating a community vision statement. You can access it at the QR code here, or we'll also include links to all resources shared after the presentation. And once you have a guiding vision, you can work to identify the right questions. So we start by moving from the broad vision to isolating specific issues that stand in the way of that ideal future. For example, the vision from Philadelphia references several interconnected domains: housing, health, safety. And for this exercise, I'll just pick one of those: housing. One local challenge could be that a lack of access to stable, affordable housing influences poor health outcomes for residents. And more than just stating the challenge, it's important to do the research to contextualize it in your specific local history. I think we'd all struggle to find some place in the US not struggling with poor outcomes at the intersection of housing and health to some degree, but every community's context to that issue has essential nuance that will guide you towards more specific research questions and more specific solutions. And once you have your challenge, you can then break it down into more focused research questions that aim to answer any gaps in knowledge, affirm or counter assumptions, or reflect the information a particular group needs to address your local mobility challenge. Effective research questions are often singularly focused, and you will develop a lot of different questions in this work. But just when you start with one, you can keep iterating from there. Moving from the vision of a healthy, safe, prosperous community to the local mobility challenge of poor housing outcomes that inhibit those goals, one potential research question could be zeroing in on a specific housing topic that is relevant to the community, like eviction. Now we need to consider what information we need to begin to answer that initial research question. Who is experiencing eviction? And are certain groups experiencing disproportionately higher rates? As a first step, some useful information would be eviction rates by race and ethnicity, and also by neighborhood for your locality. Like I mentioned at the outset, using data to inform priorities is a really iterative process. From your challenge, you derive a question, which you then research and analyze data on, and then that will bring up new insights that necessitate further, more detailed questions that need answers. Really leaning into this process of discovery through data opens up room to consider these challenges in new ways with new questions and bring in new perspectives. For example, once you analyze eviction by race and geography, you may want to next research why these groups are vulnerable to eviction. Useful information here could be housing cost burden, access to living wage jobs, and wealth disparities. And then also why certain neighborhoods experience more instability. Things like neighborhood segregation and transportation access could be interesting data points here. So now that we know what kind of information we need, let's talk about how to actually find the data you're looking for. Our data dashboard can be a great place to start from. We'll drop a link in the chat, and we have plenty of resources on the website about the specific data included here and also guidance on using the dashboard on our website. I won't reiterate the earlier framework intro, but just want to recall what I shared earlier. The data dashboard provides metrics by which to measure 24 predictors of mobility from poverty. And even if the exact metric we use to measure it isn't appropriate for your community, or if it isn't available in your locality for some reason, it can be a useful point of reference to help you find data sources. And further, our metrics are just one way to measure a predictor. We work to find metrics and sources that fit our criteria. They needed to be available across geographies and time. And so there's a lot of different ways to measure it that aren't included on the dashboard. So we encourage you to identify other ways to measure these predictors of mobility that could also help you answer your research questions. The kind of data our mobility metrics provide in the dashboard can be used for a wide range of strategic purposes. You can use that data to answer research questions that look to compare your locality's conditions to others, find interconnections between different domains, reveal inequities, and also monitor how your community is performing over time. By using the metrics holistically, so looking at a range of metrics across a range of pillars, you can get data that helps you narrow in on what aspects of people's lives most need support or intervention, and also which elements could have outcomes that are mutually reinforcing. You can also use the data to challenge your own perceptions about mobility in your area. The data you see may not square with your assumptions, which opens up an important opportunity to dig deeper into why that is. And as mentioned, disaggregating data by elements like race and ethnicity, gender, and disability status can help illuminate disparities and target solutions. Whenever possible, we include that disaggregation in the dashboard. And if the mobility metrics don't show the disaggregation you need, we have a worksheet in our toolkit with some additional guidance on one way to approach that. And the mobility metrics can help you see how data have changed over time and allow you to align your knowledge about community conditions and prior interventions with these results. We encourage that you supplement any data from national sources like the data dashboard with local data like local administrative data, historical records, or local qualitative data. This helps you get granular on the impacts of city or neighborhood level programs and potentially offer deeper insights into more specific issues. This can be particularly salient for rural communities where nationwide data sources could be insufficient because aggregated data masks significant variation across subgroups of people. One way to start this is by doing a local data landscape and identifying publicly available resources like open data portals and also local data holding institutions. And if your city doesn't have an open data portal, it's very likely that your state will or your region might. While you can go through the work of combing through administrative data and create your own useful measures, the open data portals really simplify this process as city level open data portals clean up the quality data and then aggregate it into useful neighborhood level indicators. And while outside the scope of this webinar, we find that building and sustaining coalitions and relationships also comes into play here. A solid grasp on the mobility landscape helps you identify the actors who hold the information you might need. On the slide is a QR code to access our table of 153 local data resources. Some of these are for specific states, some are for specific localities. Others combine sources to hold local or state data for a whole region or the whole country. And this can be a great place to start when you're looking for local data to supplement national sources. As you go through the data inventory process, we also have a worksheet to help you evaluate potential supplementary sources to make sure they fit your needs before investing time in collecting and analyzing the data. And again, I know we're going kind of fast and there's a lot of QR codes. We'll be sending links to all of these afterwards, so no need to rush through. Urban also has a wealth of resources on community engagement and primary data collection, a couple of which are linked here, and you can access those hyperlinks in the slide deck after this presentation. And this kind of data is another important source of local knowledge. Original surveys are a tool that many of our partners have utilized, and we include a guidance worksheet in our toolkit as well to help you determine if this would be a useful input for your initiative to invest in. And now let's talk about developing strategic priorities. All right, so you've had a vision, you've got your questions, you've collected data, and now you've analyzed it. What's on the screen is totally hypothetical, but this is the kind of analysis that can help guide your priorities. In your analysis about eviction, you might have discovered that a particular neighborhood with high eviction rates exists, or there's a specific demographic that is a large share of that same neighborhood. You also may have discovered that your locality has limited tenant protections that have been useful in other places, or that there's low affordable housing production in neighborhoods that also have high eviction rates. These kind of insights are key to move from identifying general solutions to housing and help you design specific strategic interventions. Effective strategies work to address shortcomings in systems or structures and often will cut across several domains to maximize impact. When developing strategic priorities, it can be helpful to think about how to balance short-term quick wins that help alleviate immediate needs and also longer-term aspirations of how structural change can help you achieve your vision. And by using the data analysis you've conducted, you could craft strategies that move beyond the vague, like build affordable housing, and use that data to craft a strategy that targets affordable housing development for a specific income level in a priority neighborhood that engages specific community partners to maximize the impact of your investments. One last resource I wanted to bring up here is the Results for America Economic Mobility Catalog is a really excellent repository of evidence-based strategies that boost mobility. And this can be a great place to start brainstorming policy and program interventions following your data analysis. Finally, I just want to briefly touch back on the tension I mentioned between that pressure to alleviate as much harm as we can in the present moment, stabilizing conditions, while also building towards the systems change we need to reach community prosperity. Many localities have lost or have actually never built trust with some of their community members due to either perceived inaction or perceived deprioritization of that community's needs. One way to build trust is by pushing forward solutions to address residents' chronic and acute crises and really show that you're committed to action. By stabilizing conditions and building trust through that stability, mobility and prosperity then become possible. Stabilizing also gives space for us to approach what our data analysis shows us in new ways and take risks and innovate to develop policies and programs that don't just make the best of the current structures, but actually build towards a broader vision of prosperity. And with that, I'll pass it over to my colleague, Kimberly Burrows, to introduce our panelists.
Great. Thank you so much for that overview, Gabby. Just being able to see this chart towards stability, mobility, prosperity, I think is so important for the data conversation we're having today. And for all those who filled out the poll at the beginning, you're really in the right place when you mentioned linking data to actionable strategies is something that you're really curious to hear more about. And so with that, I'm actually thrilled to invite two folks to the conversation. And these are folks who have grappled with data collection analysis to truly understand their local conditions. And so to provide a more real-world context to the conversation we have, I'm thrilled to be joined by AJ Calhoun from the Lead In on Opportunity in North Carolina, Clifton Fanawong Nelson and Helen Schaefer from Pima County, Arizona. And both of these organizations were part of Urban's Mobility Action Learning Network that we wrapped up at the end of 2024. That was a period of technical assistance where we had several different government and non-government organizations engaged in a 12-month training and technical assistance program where they were able to be provided with coaching, peer learning opportunities, data, and planning tools. So to kick off our community spotlights, I'm thrilled to welcome Clifton to the virtual stage. So Clifton, I'll pass over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Clifton Fanawong Nelson, and from Pima County, working on the Prosperity Initiative. Next slide, please. So the Prosperity Initiative is a policy framework created by Pima County, City of Tucson, and a number of local nonprofits who came together with the goal of wanting to reduce generational poverty. We use the upward mobility framework to come together and create these 13 different policies and 3 cross-policy strategies. And it's color-coded, with the first 3 being about housing, the next health, education, and then work or workforce as the priorities of how we're going to be reducing generational poverty. And so from these policies, we created 31 different indicators that we want to track over time and see how we're doing in progress of reducing generational poverty. Next slide, please. All right, so how did we go about choosing the right data indicators? As I mentioned, we had a lot of different community partners. We have government agencies, nonprofits, businesses, University of Arizona, who all came together and kind of created a task force and tried to think through, okay, we have these 13 policies, how can we track these going forward? So the Urban Institute actually has this rubric that we use to really help like narrow in and create rules so that everyone is on the same page of like having strict criteria of like what we can go through. And so some of the things that were on that rubric were clarity of data. And so what we mean by that is that is this data point specifically talking about this specific policy instead of being very broad? Like we want it to be focused and as granular as possible to what we're trying to track. For example, like number of children in childcare in certain areas. Next one is access. So of course you can sometimes data comes out yearly, every 5 years, every month, and we want to make sure that we can access it when we want to, that we don't have to, pay for it. Sometimes there's a paywall behind data, so we wanted to make sure we had access to it. Next, geographically. So a lot of times data is at a grand level. It's just looking at maybe the whole county or the whole city, but we try to find data that we could really narrow in on and look, if at possible, at the census tract level. Maybe it's neighborhood, maybe it's zip code, but as much as possible so that we can, make these data-driven decisions and know exactly like which areas are in need and not just like a broad view overall. And next, what we mean by equity is being able to, one, looking at it geographically, but also different types of demographics. And so that we can even more have like a diverse view of what's happening to by age, gender, race, income level, educational level. So as much as possible, trying to narrow down and dissect through that data. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to give a couple examples of indicators that we have chosen. The first three come from the Urban Institute's data dashboard, which we found quite reliable, and they were very specific to the policies that we decided to pick. Being the first one being percent of children experiencing poverty who live in high poverty neighborhoods, and we want to look at medical debt or different types of debt in this area. And so we actually do have these going from 2013 to 2023, if possible, but just because of space made it the last 5-year separation. We also had different sources that we used. The Census Bureau was a big one, of course. It has a lot of different indicators, things to look at on there, like household cost burden, or the one that's 16 to 24-year-olds not in school and not working is called Opportunity Youth. That's something that we really wanted to track here in Pima County, and something that we wanted to, of course, decrease. And then we used different partners. The United Way of Southern Arizona has their own dashboard that we love and is very reliable, and we wanted to keep using it. And so we were able to use that for the high quality care and education. And then I think the eviction filings is depending on the court system. We found a website that kind of scrapes the data from local courts and can provide the data about eviction filings in the area. And so obviously all of these indicators are very high level. There's things that we want to be tracking for 10 to 30 years. And if we want to track progress, it's going to be things that we'll have to use like statistical analysis to see if this X and Y program that we created had an impact on childhood poverty. But we thought it was like a great beginning point and baseline to track going forward. Next slide, please. So I wanted to provide 2 examples of how we're using data and data indicators in making decisions or changing things. So the first one is looking at eviction data. And so as I mentioned, we have those evictions at like the county level, but we also have them available looking at addresses, and we can use the addresses to track on a map geographically where there are hotspots. Pima County also has a program called EELS, which is the Emergency Eviction and Legal Services Program, which is helping people who might be at risk or eviction or being evicted with legal support, housing support. And we also have that data that we're tracking with geographically and addresses. So a way that we could use that is, one, we see where a lot of evictions are happening, and we're seeing where a lot of our EOS clients are. And so obviously we want to identify these hotspots, maybe have more support there, put more information there. But we can also see where there's a lot of evictions, but we don't have our EOS clients there. And so maybe that can show that there's a gap in where we need to provide more resources, more help in those certain areas. So just looking at things geographically and being able to zoom in as much as possible is extremely helpful with making programmatic data decisions going forward. The next example was a bit larger for the Pima County area. There was an outside entity that came in and did a study of Pima County and did a type of a gap analysis of using similar data points that we have in our indicators, like housing affordability, vacant lots, and whatnot. And they did a study to present to our the Board of Supervisors and show in the next 10 years, these are the type of affordable housing units or different types of housing units that need to be built or and funded so that we don't have a gap of housing for by population going forward. And so the board heard this and got this report, and they were able to invest 250 million over the next 10 years to build affordable housing and different types of housing in the area. Next slide, please. So this is more like internally and how we're leveraging data. I know the city of Tucson and Pima County both did this, and we did a kind of like an inventory where the Prosperity Initiative team went around to different departments within the county and got a baseline of like what they're doing right now that aligns with the Prosperity Initiative. What are they doing that helps reduce generational poverty? And that was super useful just to get, we have departments from health to sheriffs to sewage and wastewater. And so we wanted to kind of get everyone involved in what they're doing right now to help out with this initiative and get people on the same page. Similar with different types of communication surveys or dashboards, we're able to see what type of message we're putting out and if people are understanding what the goal of our initiative is. So doing surveys with directors in different departments to seeing if they understand or if we need to help clarify certain points of our initiative. Lastly, something that we're trying to work towards is when building our budget, how we can have like buckets of aligned with different policies and tagging them to make sure that we have X and Y amount of money for policy 9 or whatnot. And so having a budget based approach is important to our supervisors, to the Board of Supervisors, and something we're working on going forward. Next slide, please. And so how we're going to be monitoring and measuring this progress, as I said, we're going to have the public facing dashboard, and that's going to be more for long-term change, looking at 10, 20 years, how have things been going up or down or improving. And that will be help to drive policy decisions, budgeting decisions going forward. But also something we want to do is more internal government tracking of outputs. So I work within the workforce development department, and this could be, we want to build more apprenticeships for people to earn higher wage jobs. So we're going to track how many apprenticeships have been added in the last year, 5 years. Are we meeting these milestones? How many houses have been being built? And our goals being met that we put forward. So having more of evaluation type tracking within as a whole will be a whole other aspect of my job going forward. Next slide, please. So apologies if I went super quick there. But again, my name's Clifton Fenelong Nelson. I'm the Research and Data Analysis Manager. If you have questions, please email me. And if I don't know the answer, I will connect you to the right person. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation, Clifton. And while you were going through the slides, we did have a few questions come in and wanted to just give you the opportunity to respond to some of the audience questions now. There's actually been a lot of interest in what data sources you ended up using for this work. And so would love to hear a little bit about what sources Pima County purchased. And if you have any recommendations on resources you would recommend for groups who are looking to find similar data that you all used.
Okay. Yeah. So we did not purchase any data, but I just put that out there as like there are definitely times where you might see that, and I wanted to avoid it because I know that if you can just dig deeper, there will be available data out there, and I didn't want to purchase anything. But so different types of sources definitely relied heavily on, the Urban Institute, the Census Bureau, looking at like whether that's housing, or let's see, child poverty rates. Then we use local nonprofits like United Way of Southern Arizona, who has a dashboard, and I know that they connect with the state of Arizona, to kind of collect more of the education, childcare type of data sets. And then when it comes to very like unique ones, we have two for that comes, I think it's called FRAMS data, which I think comes from the CDC, looking at unintended pregnancy rates. So if you have more health type initiatives, that might be either looking at your state level or looking at federal level data sets. And yeah, that's it.
Great. Thank you, Clifton. And for folks who are dropping questions in, we will have time after the next presentation to go back to them. So this is not your last opportunity. And so with that, I'm going to pass the mic over to AJ. Take it away.
Hey, folks. Thanks, Kimberly. It's really great to be with y'all to share a little bit about the story of our organization, Leading on Opportunity, and the work that's been happening in Charlotte, North Carolina over the course of the past decade. Uh, if you go on to the next slide, you can just see a couple of quick points about what I'm hoping to do over the course of the next 10 minutes or so. The first is really to tell you the story of our data tool. How did we build it? What were some of the places where we, as we often say, where we stubbed our toe, where we learned lessons about how not to build a data tool? And as we go through this story, I want to highlight a couple of key areas. One, really thinking about who our audience was and how that informed the kind of metrics that we ended up selecting and the way that we packaged them. Second, I want to talk a little bit about additional kinds of data and information that can be wrapped around some of these ecosystem measures that you might find in tools like the Mobility Metrics Dashboard, or as you may be building for your own communities. And then I want to talk also, as we go through this story, a bit about ways to kind of get innovative with some of the things that maybe are more difficult to measure. But given some of the things we'll talk about in the front half, hopefully you'll see the way in which kind of these approaches work. So if you go on to the next slide, I think it's important just to level set a bit about Leading on Opportunity as an organization. So we're not a government entity. We're not a nonprofit like program provider, although we're a nonprofit ourselves. But really, we sit at this kind of systems level intersection of all of these kind of organizations, really working to try to advance a kind of comprehensive strategy for our region. We were started back in 2014 when Raj Chetty published a list of the 50 largest metro areas in the nation and a child's ability to rise out of poverty if they were born into it in any of those places. And back in 2014, Charlotte was ranked the worst place in America, 50 out of 50 on economic mobility. This was really a wake-up call for folks in our community. I think particularly folks who maybe sit in those traditional civic leadership positions. For folks who are doing the work on a daily basis, or for folks who are experiencing these challenges, this was not new news. But in a community like Charlotte, where we were used to being at the top of lists, for most millennials or most breweries per capita, or what have you, this was what seemed to be the most important list, and the one that we were so disappointed to find ourselves lacking in. So, as many communities do, we convened a group of cross-sector leaders to try to think about what do we need to do if we wanted to make change on this. And that group put out this task force report. One of the kind of key pieces to the report was that we should have a group of people who wake up every day thinking about how to move the needle on this. Oftentimes, these sorts of economic mobility initiatives end up as kind of side of the desk work for people who sit in some other kind of job. And while that can be a really great way to begin this, one of the things we've learned from a decade of working on this in Charlotte and Mecklenburg County is that you need people who have this as their full-time remit. This is the thing that they're thinking about all day, every day. And if we don't do that, then we won't be able to really move the needle. As we've done this work over the course of the past decade, our region has been able to invest over $1 billion into moving the needle on economic mobility. And we're really excited to say that in 2024, Dr. Chetty ran a new study where he re-ranked communities. And because of these kinds of historical investments that we had been making, Charlotte rose from 50th to 38th and became the third most improving place in America. And a lot of this story about what we're doing at Leading on Opportunity, what Charlotte and Mecklenburg County are doing kind of more broadly, what all of our organizational partners are doing, whether they be funders or nonprofits, this all is a story that begins with data. So on the next slide, you can see a little bit about the way that we think about the connectivity between the three key things that we focus on in our organization: data, strategy, and policy. We really think about data as the starting place. This is where we think about what is the right question to be asking. Because if we get the question wrong, we're almost certainly going to get the answer wrong. Strategy helps us take that raw information and organize entities, programs, investors, individuals together so that we can think about what would it look like to solve this challenge. And of course, policy helps us to change the conditions, the systems and structures which put us in this position in the first place. I think it's important while we're on this slide just to talk a little bit about kind of the differences between types of data that you may be looking at in your own initiative. We had to spend a lot of time in our work helping people understand the difference between ecosystem measures, like the kinds of things that I'll share we capture in our data tool. Things like the poverty rate, housing affordability in your region, graduation rates, things like that. These are the types of things where, graduation rates is a great example. This happens once a year. We're not going to see kids graduating every week, although I have had, people in our community ask us the question, why can't we get this kind of data more frequently? And it's like, well, this is something that just happens only every so often. It makes sense that we're a year or so behind on these sorts of things. But that's very different from programmatic data. At the systems level, I think we're not looking as specifically at these, which were the specific participants, what intervention did they receive, and kind of what were the relative outcomes. And so we had to do some kind of data literacy training for folks in our community to help them understand what were we trying to build. And as we did that, understanding who we were building for. If you go on to the next slide, when we began this work, we knew it was very important that we build a tool to track our progress. We understood early on that the main audience for this tool, for a tool that would look at not the program level data, but this ecosystem level data, these were funders and nonprofits. This is who we were really talking to. And when these folks were asking questions about data, they wanted to understand kind of three things. They wanted to understand what are the metrics that matter when we think about economic mobility. A lot of people are talking about this in our community, in perhaps your community. They need to know, what should we really be looking at? Second, they needed to answer the question, how are these things changing over time? Are we moving in the right direction, or do we need to be leaning in more? And third, and I think this is really the most powerful part of this that I'll dive into here in a bit, is how are people aligning their programs and investments to these common metrics? Because we're not going to be able to make point in time, day by day decisions based off the poverty rate. But what we can do is, using these ecosystem level metrics, we can understand who's working on what, who's funding what, and how are we making those changes over time. This is a strategic kind of question rather than a program evaluative kind of question. If we go on to the next slide, the opportunity compass breaks down the kind of question of economic mobility into 5 factors. We have had the great chance of working with Urban through the Mobility Action Learning Network, and these look very similar to the pillars that Gabby shared at the beginning. Although the task force report slightly predates the mobility metrics dashboard, it's still very similar work. So I don't think you need to have the same ones that we have, because I think what you can see in the kind of congruity between our work and Urban's work is that these questions are the same. They have a high level of fidelity across places. But just to give you a sense of kind of how we seek measurement for any one of these, let's take, for example, college and career readiness. If we go on to the next slide, you can see the way in which we break down our tool. So college and career readiness has 17 measures. Examples of these measures include things like disconnected youth, first year persistence rates at local institutions, who's getting career and technical education. Each one of these measures are things that we're either drawing on a national, state, or local source, or we're asking for a kind of private data deposit from a partner. On the next slide, you can see a few more of these examples and the way in which we use this information to do the three things that I outlined at the beginning. See, what are we focused on? How is this changing over time? And who's working on this? I think these three kind of questions are important, linking back to this question about audience, because our audience is looking for a 60-second, 30,000-foot view of the landscape of economic mobility. We built this tool in large part in partnership with our corporate sector. They're a major investor in Charlotte in these sorts of initiatives. And the questions that they were asking were not about the granularity of the number of pencils or backpacks that were given out, but they were asking questions about we're getting X number of grant requests each year. We want to understand what are the kinds of things that move the needle on economic mobility, and how can we discern between that and the things that are maybe good to be doing, but aren't the most targeted towards this. So when we sought out to build this tool, we really wanted to understand exactly that. Thinking about that audience question also helps you navigate what I think is maybe the most challenging aspect of building a really powerful data tool in your community, which is that it's not so much a methodological challenge as it is a political challenge. You need to understand what the people who are asking for this tool want to use it for. And so, for instance, when we began this, I think we had a couple of false starts because we were trying to answer the question of how do we build a data tool like it was a research project. And in a sense, we did need that kind of a research rigor to do this work well. However, because we were designing for philanthropy leaders or nonprofit executives, these folks were asking questions that were fundamentally different. And so, in partnership with our CEO roundtable, we were able to develop the compass as something that kind of got around some of the stickiness and was accurate in a way that helped us answer kind of the questions that people were asking us. If we go on to the next tool, the next slide, you can see the way in which we bring all of this together. We've got 82 indicators, but we really group them together so people can see them all in one place. I think the link to the tool is posted on the page and maybe in the chat as well. If you click through this, you'll see when you arrive at the homepage of the tool, it's this one-shot view. We've got these kind of thermometers that give you a sense of, are we moving in the right direction or not? It's very quick. In addition to the kind of classic metrics that we're looking at here, we add a couple of additional layers of data to surround these things that move a bit more quickly and things that help us to make those strategic decisions. So not only are we measuring ACT scores themselves, but we're also measuring what funders are investing in programs that are targeted at improving ACT scores and what nonprofits are particularly aligning their theories of change to the improvement of ACT or SAT scores. These two additional factors help us to think about where the resources of time and money are coming from to move the needle on this. You can see how it's important to have that in context with the metric itself if we want to make a change on this. There are two additional pieces of context that I'll get into in a moment. But I want to take just a brief moment to tell you about an example of how we had an area of work, social capital, that maybe is a question that you're asking in your community. If you go on to the next slide, you can see just a snapshot of the opportunity compass when it comes to this measure. This is an area where there's been an enormous amount of debate about whether it's even possible to measure this locally. But what we wanted to do is we wanted to develop a way of capturing this that helped us to keep these metrics top of mind. We are confident that the metrics that we have here, some of which come from national sources, some of which are things that we're trying to develop locally, Every single one of these is not perfect, but the goal in measurement, particularly at the ecosystem level, is not perfection. It's directional accuracy. It's we want to understand, are we moving in the right direction? And so when we bring this information together, we can try a few new things. And I want to offer them to you. One, within the case study of using not only the mobility metrics, but also another tool that Urban has developed called the Spatial Data Equity Tool. If we go on to the next page, you can see the way in which we break down the concept of social capital, about half of it is moving up and half of it is moving down into these what we call drivers. Things like access to opportunity, collective flourishing, strong communities, supportive neighbors. We really want to be thematic about the way that we think through these concepts because that's the way that our stakeholders often look at these. And you can see under each one, access to opportunity. We've got 3 outcomes that we're tracking here. 2 of them are moving up, 1 of them is moving down. If you click into this, you can see one of the outcomes under I think it's under the collective flourishing tab on the next slide, is the number of library cards that people have. We're tracking that not only kind of immediately, but we're tracking it. If you go on to the next slide, you can see an example of the way that we're doing this. We're tracking this by running it through this spatial data equity tool that Urban has built. And we're looking at every single person who owns a library card. We're plotting them geographically. And we want to understand whether certain demographic groups are over or underrepresented in their ownership of library cards and their access, therefore, to this kind of civic institution that builds social capital. We were able to use this spatial data equity tool to really help us understand across 41 different demographic groups, how is this working? And then this helps us as we have conversations, for example, with our library or with our county who invests in the library, what we might want to do differently to make sure that we're accurately representing all populations in this. One additional piece that I want to lift up here as we're looking at this tool on the next slide, if you scroll down underneath any one of our metrics, you can see not only who's funding this and who's working on this, local nonprofits and philanthropies, but you can also see what we call additional resources. Here's where we've linked national level data tools to our own tools. So you can see the mobility metrics resource here to see what they're tracking on social capital. Earlier, the Results for America Economic Mobility Catalog was linked. We often get policymakers in particular who look at a particular data object on the compass and they say, well, what should I be doing about this? Or a nonprofit as well. If you use the mobility metrics or the Economic Mobility Catalog, both of them have robust tools that show you what are proven practices, what are things that have been shown to work in one or more rigorous evaluations. This is, again, where we get this difference between an ecosystem level question and a programmatic question. And this here is a great way to be able to see what you do with this data, with these discrete activities. And so we're able to advise, for instance, our city council, when they have come to us and said, what could we be doing? We can index all the activities that they're doing as an organization, and then where there are opportunities for them to improve the investments or the programs that they're working on. Of course, the Opportunity Insights work is great from a geographical perspective. If you go one slide forward, I want to add just one additional layer. So I've talked about, not only the metrics themselves, but also integrating funding data, aligning nonprofit theories of change. We've got over 100 nonprofits that have aligned themselves to this tool, over $50 million of philanthropic funding aligned to this tool. We've shown you the kind of policy activities that are aligned to this. The last piece on the next slide is, what do people who experience these challenges want us to be working on? We go across the community, north, south, east, and west, in English and in Spanish, and we ask this question at the driver and the determinant level to understand, where do folks want us to be focused? You can see we do this about every 3 years. You can see the way in which priorities are changing. It's a really powerful aspect because we're able to then weight the tool. Using this information, this allows us to make sure that the voices of people who experience economic mobility challenges on a daily basis are quantitatively incorporated. And that really is the 5th piece of this kind of contextualizing puzzle that helps us to get the kind of robust information that helps us to not only know, what's the top line metric that we should be looking at, but how would we want to maybe make a change? And we've used these kinds of information to help inform these sorts of programmatic and policy recommendations that we make to various entities in our community. So happy to go into more of this when we get into the questions, but that's a bit about what we're doing at Leading on Opportunity.
Great. Thank you so much for the presentation, AJ. And we did have a question come in I'd love for you to respond to before we open up a full panel. An audience member raised that their community is saturated with dashboards and data tools, and they're sensing this, data fatigue. I know this is something that you've spoken about in the past. So how
Yeah.
do you build trust in your data, propose strategy? How do you really bridge that understanding of how worthwhile and meaningful this can be for the community?
I think this is absolutely the right question to be asking because oftentimes people go straight to let's build a new thing, let's do a new landscape analysis. The first question to ask is, do we really need this? And if not, that's okay. There may be other places for your organization to play, making sense of all the things that already exist. We do an enormous amount of linking between our tool and other local tools when we do this work in Charlotte. The second piece is if you are convinced that you do need to build something new, you need to understand what's the question and who is the person who is going to use that answer to make a change in your community. For us, we had an enormous amount of these tools already existing in Charlotte, but our corporate sector was the main investor in economic mobility, didn't feel like that they had a good sense of how all this came together. Could we have a landscape analysis of all the landscape analyses to kind of automate this process? So that's exactly what we built because we knew that the question that was being asked was not answered, but we could bring together all these other pieces of data to answer this question.
Great. Thank you for that. And I actually would like to invite Clifton and Helen to rejoin myself and AJ up here on the screen. And we're going to transition into a bit of a panel to respond to all of these questions I see coming into the Q&A box. Keep them coming, everyone. I know that you've sat through hearing a few presentations at the local level, and Gabby gave the overview of the framework and the mobility metrics and how we've thought about data. And so we just want to dive right in. One of the things that came in really early on was looking at the upward mobility data dashboard. There are some areas where data are not available. We do have data available for all counties and for cities with a population greater than 75,000. And one thing I can share is that updates are expected this month for 2024 data, and we'll have additional metrics available in the spring and summer of 2026. But going back to this concern around folks that just don't see themselves represented here, um, how would you all recommend some ways that they can collect local data to supplement the gaps of what's not publicly available? And Clifton, I'd love to turn to you first to give some advice to folks in the audience.
Yeah, so I guess like I was trying to think through this and like when not publicly available, I wasn't sure if you meant like not in the Urban Institute or even like when you're looking at the Census Bureau, it's not there either. And if so, then maybe relying on like local nonprofits who, or maybe schools or universities. I guess it's hard to tell because not knowing which community it is. So yeah, trying to see in the community if anyone or any initiatives are collecting data. And if not, maybe that is the priority is like creating a team to start collecting data and making surveys that best for you. Hopefully
I
that
think
answered.
that's great, Clifton, because I think you're also raising an important point of who are the data actors in the community that might have some of these data. And AJ, I'd love to invite you to jump in here because you did mention working with multiple different sources.
Yeah. I mean, I think for us, there's kind of a two-layered answer to this question. One, there are just going to be things that are difficult to measure. And so if that's the case, we need to think about, are there proxies that exist? To Clifton's point, maybe there is something that's being measured, but it's in a place where it's not publicly available. We have a lot of data about low-income educational pathways because we've built relationships with the presidents of all of our regional colleges and universities, as well as our career and technical education and workforce development ecosystem, and they provide us private data that helps to answer questions that we wouldn't otherwise be able to share. But you still may not be able to answer the questions that you want to answer in that way. If that's the case, I think the survey kind of suggestion that Clifton makes is a good one. There's lots of great tools out there. I think Urban has cataloged some of these as well, existing instruments that are valid that you can use to do this work. But I wouldn't be hesitant to start by just going to the places where the people who you want to be understanding more are spending a lot of time and listening, because you might find that you don't need to run a $20,000, survey just to find out something that the five community leaders that spend all of their time working with this population or who represent this population or live in this neighborhood, they already probably know the answer to this question. And that can give you 90% of the information that you need to start developing potential solutions. So I think, I come from this kind of like design first kind of approach to policy making. And I think that this listening piece can be a really powerful thing even before we get to the quantitative data. We can't discount these kind of story data points as well.
Mhm. That's such a great point, really trying to marry the quantitative story with the qualitative story so we truly understand some of those local conditions. And speaking of sort of the bringing together of different folks, I imagine that you all may have had to develop some data sharing agreements to really knit all of this together. And AJ, I'm going to start with you this time, but could you talk a little bit about that process of bringing together multiple data sources? And if you did have any data sharing agreements, what did those look like? And especially identifying what are some of the entities that you were able to seek out, and was that difficult? Was that something that was easy for you all to pursue?
Yeah, I think two things that I'll call out at the top. One is Charlotte is very blessed to have a single educational entity. So I think probably most communities, when they think about data sharing agreements, the top thing on your mind is, we have 16 school districts in our metro. How do we get all these people together? I'm probably not the best person to answer that part of the question, but we do have a lot of data relationships. And I'll say the kind of second piece that I'll lift up is uh, data sharing at a high quality, high fidelity, successful level. It begins with relationships. People have to trust that the team that's doing the number crunching is going to handle their data well, tell their story effectively, and it's not going like that. We're not going to try to gotcha with this information. So, for instance, we have data sharing agreements I mentioned earlier with all the regional colleges and universities in our area where they provide us private data. We have a data sharing kind of partnership with our local school district. That one, they had historically had lots of folks like Leading on Opportunity who wanted their data because they wanted to publish a headline in the newspaper that said, "Oh, here's all the ways in which this entity is not doing a good job." We were really, really careful, and it took us a long time to build the trust to say we want to tell the story of your success. Of course, there are places where the community can lean in, to provide funding or programmatic support for the initiatives that you want to accomplish. But we want to partner with you to tell this story. So I think it's really important that relationality and the posture that you come to this with. This has helped us in kind of what I think is maybe the most non-traditional kind of data sharing agreements that we have, which is with a number of our corporate partners who are providing to us kind of dollar down to the dollar level information about the way that they're investing philanthropically in our region. And for that, we have very good people who checked all the like kind of legal structures that we use here. Where are we storing this? How is it getting displayed? And I think that will kind of depend on your particular entity and kind of how you can hold that. There are also pieces of data that, because of the kind of entity that we are, we just don't hold. For instance, we never have any personal identifying information. We have a good partnership with our regional data trust, which is part of the National Neighborhood Indicators partnership, and they hold all that personal identifying information because we just are not in a kind of legal or technological position to hold that. So I think for data sharing to be successful, it's about relationships, it's about making sure people trust you to tell the story well, and it's about being honest with yourself about what you can actually do within the confines of, I don't want 10,000 students social security number sitting on my personal laptop. That's just not a position that I want to be in. But there are people in our community who are, who do have the structure to do that.
Thank you, AJ. And I think underlying all of that is really the positionality that you all have and the relationships that you've built. And so, Clifton, I actually want to pose the same question to you about data sharing agreements because you all at the county, you have a different position. So curious what that's looked like.
Yeah, well, I guess I'll say that we've been quite lucky that we haven't had any data sharing agreements. Most of the data that we're using is publicly available, or it's like as AJ was talking about, it's from these relationships we've built with nonprofits or like the other government entities here. And being that Helen and I are within Pima County, within the workforce development department, we kind of see that as like the heart of this initiative. And there's a lot of data already collected here. And so it's a matter of me becoming friends with everyone in this department and making sure that they know I'm the data guy who wants to like show their work and show that they're making an impact with this prosperity initiative. And so, yeah, it's building relationships.
Mhm.
It's getting buy-in from everybody, from the university to nonprofits, that this is the goal for this whole region going forward. So yeah, we haven't had to do any data sharing agreements. We definitely might in the future, and I think I will probably reach out to AJ for how to go forward with that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Clifton. And I want to stay on this theme of partnership for a second because I think you made such an important point when you said the buy-in portion. And really considering that as you're doing the Prosperity Initiatives, is something that's happening over a period of time, I'm sure it's incredibly important to ensure that you do have the buy-in for some of these key decision makers. And, someone in the audience had asked this question of what happens when they weren't present during the data metric selection process? How do you then get their buy-in at a later stage? So once you're actually implementing something, not just selecting the metrics or the benchmarks at the onset. And I'd love to hear how Pima County has thought about this.
But, I think showing like the background work that we all put into it before this, and like showing like, for example, that we use this rubric, that we have like kind of like the receipts of like what we did to get to where we are, will be helpful with like showing people it's like we have like this is what we went through, this is our thought process of going through this whole thing, and this is why the decision we made. And obviously not everything is like soundproof. Maybe there's changes or new ideas that people will have, and love to include it. But I think that's like our best way of when new people come in, um, yeah, and showing like what we did.
Mhm. Great. And AJ, I want to ask you the same thing because I know, you just launched the dashboard and this is something that's been garnering a lot of attention. And so for folks that weren't participating in the beginnings of that process, what is it like right now and going into next year to engage them?
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's a kind of tipping point where the question changes. Uh, Up to the point where you have something that's working and you can stand behind it and say, well, come along on this journey with us because it's being successful. Before that, it's entirely about the relationships that you have. And I think when we launched the kind of update to the tool that we released back in 2021 this fall, the biggest thing for us is the tool was done being built over a year before we shared it publicly because we wanted to make sure that every single person who had a stake in this, nonprofit leaders, funders, government leaders, all of them had seen it and had felt like that they were part of the process to build this, engaging people even before we started to put pen to paper on it. And so it's a multi-year process. It feels very slow sometimes from the outside, even from the inside. But this kind of socialization work is, I think, what's made it successful in Charlotte. Is not only making sure that as we put updates out into the world, that people feel more and more confident that why we have this is proving itself out in the way in which people are using it, but also that each of those stakeholders, whether they be new or whether they've been at the table from before even I was here, that everyone feels like that they trust this process and that they importantly feel like that their voice was included in this process. Now, that's you have to be super clear about who your audience is and who your decision makers are to do that. Uh, and it takes an enormous amount of time, but I think it's the only way. I said this in my presentation. It's the only way for this to be successful. Building effective data tools has way more to do with politics than it does with methodology.
That's such a great point, especially saying, capital T trust and the data that sits on many of these data dashboards, the metrics. At the end of the day, these are people that we're talking about and people's conditions. And so when you all think about the residents and ways in which to really bring them into the fold to understand and to share the story of what's happening through the metrics, I'm curious if you have any insights on the types of inclusion or capacity building activities that you can do, with residents in partnership with them so that they're part of the process and it's not just a data dashboard that sits on a website. And I'd love to actually start off this conversation with Pima County just to hear a little bit about how you've engaged some of your residents in doing this work.
Well, I think this is actually something that we're going to start in the new year, is that going to having what they call like there are a lived experience cohort where within a number of nonprofits in the area that we want to go and talk to people and show them the different indicators, the thought process, and like showing changes over time and like kind of getting feedback of like, does this quantitative data, which is what it is this telling what kind of story is this telling you? And is this like what you might be feeling or what you have felt like in the community? And if not, like what are we missing? I guess like going in and yeah, just trying to learn as much as possible. So having a number of these groups in different areas within Tucson and Pima County, which is a very diverse area, either urban or rural, and have Native American tribes as well. And so talking to different groups and seeing what they think going forward. I don't know if Helen, if you have anything to add on to that.
Great. Thank
No,
you,
okay.
Clifton. And AJ, what about you all? Like, how have you been thinking about engaging residents?
Yeah, I think I shared a bit about our what we call our community weighting methodology in my presentation, and if you explore the compass, you can see a lot more about the way that we're tracking information related to what individuals want to be focused on. And I think one of the pieces that's really critical there is, as you said, Kimberly, a moment ago, for us, all of this data is just stories in the aggregate, particularly when you look at data points where it's very clear, educational data, for example. There are 10,000 kids who come through our school district in any given year that graduate, like go on to graduate. It's like any metric about this population, this is a metric about their stories, about the way they navigate this system. And so it's important for us that we contextualize that anytime we're talking about it. I think the second piece that's important here is that we do this listening, that we go out across the community and we make sure that we're specifically talking to people who traditionally maybe are not at the table, and that those folks feel like not only are we coming to ask them questions, but that we always come back and share after we've done the analysis, how did this figure in? And we've often, in addition to just creating space for this, a couple of intentionalities that we do when we do this, and I have to give credit to our director of civic advancement, Tanya Jameson. She's the one who has kind of architected the way that we have done this. But one, we will often, almost always, partner with a nonprofit that is already convening that group. So we're attending a meeting that was already happening. And then we're providing some sort of incentive, of course, to be there. But this helps us to not create a new space. We're entering a space that already exists. And in this way, we're coming to someone else's table. We're not inviting people to our office. We're going to a place that's already made, and we're just asking a question in that space. The second thing that we have done from time to time is bring in decision makers that may be relevant to this conversation so that they can sit in the back and listen. They're not here to give their stump speech to get elected or whatever it is, but they're here to take in the information that's being shared in that space. If we're not able to do that, we'll capture all the information and we'll share it with the relevant decision makers so that those folks can have kind of immediate access to the information that's generated outside just the specific kind of structured instrument that we're deploying in a community conversation. One additional piece that I'll lift up here is when we work with nonprofits, I think it's very similar to working with residents in the sense that these are folks oftentimes that are residents themselves and just have a little bit more structure around their work to kind of create the impact that they're trying to create. And for that, it's really important for us that we always give back more than we ask for. So for every one of the 104 nonprofits that's part of the Opportunity Compass, we wrote a 15-page report on exactly how the things that they're doing impact economic mobility. And for us, not only does that help in building trust, but it also helps in people understanding that like we're really going to do what we say we're going to do, and we have their best interest at heart. And it helps us to make the system feel a lot less like this kind of vague, nebulous thing, but a tapestry of individuals who are all trying to work to make this place better.
Great. Thank you both, because this really humanizes what we're trying to do here when we talk about these local conditions, the mobility metrics, the ways in which we're using data dashboards to truly tell how local strategies are trying to make a difference in communities and for residents and their families. And so really appreciate everything that you've shared today. And I'm hoping that everyone in the webinar can just give a big round of applause for our speakers today. I know that there were several other questions that popped up in the question box, and unfortunately we couldn't get to everything before we close out, but we'll just try to go ahead and share out as many resources as we can following up the webinar. And so there are a few different ways in which you all can stay in touch with us about upcoming events and resources. You can go ahead and visit our website. It's up on the screen, upwardmobility.urban.org, and you can check out our event page to see what's coming up next. You can also subscribe to our newsletter that will pop up in your inbox so you'll have first access of everything that's going on. We also welcome you to reach out to us directly, especially folks that didn't have their questions answered today, and we can go ahead and get your questions answered as we are able. We'll be dropping links in the chat. You'll see them coming in as I'm speaking right now. So any questions you have, please drop them there and go ahead and click on those links. And finally, as we close out, if you could please go ahead and scan our QR code and fill out a brief survey about today's session. We would so much appreciate that. This helps us learn what we did well and what you all would like to see next coming from us. So with that, I want to conclude and say thank you so much for joining us today, and feel free to log on for workshops in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.